Have you ever wondered which author would win in a fight? It's important to, when you read about something scientific, don't just take everything on faith, but consider the kind of source you're looking at and the kind of expectations they have, the kind of things they favor. And I think our readings today really highlight this. IQ is something that we think a lot about in our society and has been used historically to really classify and separate people. When I was in fifth grade, I had a teacher who didn't like me. And I think in retaliation sent me down to the guidance counselor to have an IQ test to see if I was mentally challenged. That was fun. Anyway, you're not here to hear about my trauma, but you're here to hear about Gladwell and Gould. Let's talk for a minute about expectations and how it changes how you read and the kind of questions and the things you should ask. Let's take a sample text. In the beginning, the universe was created. Immediately, you're going to come at this with some kind of expectations from the way the text is worded, from the way the language is used, for all the things the author does. And to my mind, this first sentence puts across the kind of expectation that we're in for something that's a little bit biblical, that we're in for something that's serious and heavy. How does this proceed? In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move. Is this still biblical in tone? No, not really. Instead, this change in language and subject tends to make us think that we're going to be in for something that's rather cynical. The creation of the universe was a bad move? We're not going to be happy-go-lucky. But let's continue. In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move. Many races believe that it was created by some sort of god, though the Jatravarid people of Vodal 6 believe that the entire universe was in fact sneezed out of the nose of a being called the Great Green Arkel-Seizure. The Jatravarids, who live in perpetual fear of the time they call the coming of the Great White Handkerchief, are small blue creatures with more than 50 arms each, who are therefore unique in being the only race in history to have invented the aerosol deodorant before the wheel. Now, if there's a thought to this, it's that we've moved away from biblical, moved through cynical, and now we're in just surreal, where meaning doesn't have a lot of direct and easy connections. And if you've ever read the work this was Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you know that's a pretty apt description of what goes on. You might have come at this with some immediate expectations, but they were quickly subverted, and then subverted again, and then twisted until they're a little crumbly thing that you're going to find underneath your chair. This is one of the reasons why you have to be very careful as a reader, and know the kind of questions you should be asking, know how your expectations are going to be twisted, and know how this should guide how you get meaning out of things. In academics, we talk a lot about critical thinking and critical reading. It's more than just a general term. It implies coming at any subject, asking specific things. What's happening? Gather the basic information and begin to think of questions. Why is it important? Ask yourself why it's significant and whether or not you agree. It's not just about are things accurate. It's is there a reason for us to know this? What don't I see? Is there anything important missing? How do I know? Ask yourself where the information came from and how it was constructed. As you read academic texts, I've always suggested that you do it actively. You write, you take notes, you write in the margins, you put in post-its, asking and marking things like this is important, keywords, details, things you understand, things you don't understand, what's surprising, what connections are you making. However you do this is going to give you a whole lot of insight, not just to the text you're reading and the meaning it's supposed to communicate, but the world in which the text comes from, the field it comes from, what the expectations are, how this would work in different audiences, really a limitless amount of questions. So with all this in mind, let's talk a bit about our readings. Start off with Stephen Jay Gould. Stephen Jay Gould, first thing you need to know about him is he's an academic. So he's going to come at things a lot differently than a layperson would. He's a paleontologist by trade, which means that, yeah, dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are cool, right? But it's not just, hey, I want to find a new dinosaur. There's a certain level of thinking that comes in with being a scientist. One of the things that Stephen Jay Gould has always been very clear about is that you have to have a proper understanding of what fact means. Fact does not mean absolute certainty. The final proofs of logic and mathematics flow deductively from stated premises and achieve certainty only because they are not about the empirical world. Evolutionists make no claim for perpetual truth, though creationists often do, and attack us for a style of argument that they themselves favor. In science, fact can only mean confirmed to such a degree that it would be perverse to withhold provisional assent. I suppose that apples might start to rise tomorrow. The possibility doesn't merit equal time in physics classrooms. So, being a paleontologist means you have to go based on the information you have and the information you work with and the information you discover, and it means that that has to be your guide. Now, since you're a dinosaur, something that's no longer with us, it means evolution is going to be a very prime concern. But evolution tends to be misread in our society an awful lot. You've heard terms like social Darwinism and the idea that survival of the fittest isn't just how creatures evolved, but how we as humans have evolved our society. And this is something that Stephen Jay Gould fights a lot. And he's quite vocal about doing this in public. Now, the reading we have for today, or this week, or whenever you're watching this video, is very snarky in tone. And that's actually how I first approached this text, by looking, where is he being bitingly sarcastic? Where is he just getting his teeth into things? And what does that teach us? And I've come up with a bunch of very snarky, bitingly sarcastic quotes from this stuff. This is directly scanned from my reading. The first claim rehashes the tenets of social Darwinism as originally constituted. He doesn't like social Darwinism. When you read this, you probably got, but you kind of can gather that by rehashing. Is rehashing ever a good thing? The general claim is neither uninteresting nor illogical, but it does require the validity of four shaky premises. Shaky is another term which immediately shows that he feels the thing he's describing isn't very solid. The cranky advocacy of William Shockley. One can't grasp the issue at all without a clear exposition of factor analysis, and the bell curve cops out completely on the central concept. Cops out. Distressing as I find the anachronism of the bell curve, I am even more distressed by its pervasive disingenuousness. He is definitely not holding back here. When a scientist says something is disingenuous, well, he says the authors omit facts, misuse statistical methods, and seem unwilling to admit the consequences of their own words. Like so many conservative ideologues who rail against a largely bogus ogre of suffocating political correctness. Largely bogus ogre. I love that phrase. The book is a manifesto of conservative ideology, and its sorry and biased treatment of data records the primary purpose, advocacy above all. And the final bit of snark that I ran across here was, I have never seen anything so feeble, so unlikely, so almost grotesquely inadequate. Where I kept reading this going, gee, how do you really feel about this? Now, Stephen Jay Gould is very direct and abrupt, and this is probably not a tone you want to use yourself in your writing. Stephen Jay Gould is, if you know any paleontologist, he's the one, so he carries a certain cultural weight that he's obviously not scared of throwing around in arguments. But if we look at these quotes deeply, and aside from the fact that he's offended by a lot of the stuff the bell curve says, let's look at why he's offended. And it largely has to do with the use and misuse of evidence. Evidence is very important to Stephen Jay Gould. He's someone who makes a living by digging things out of the ground and trying to come up with a good framework for what he discovers. Without evidence, you're just making stuff up, and you can see that this mortally offends Stephen Jay Gould. Evidence is the prime thing he's worried about. Now, let's compare and contrast that with Malcolm Gladwell. Awesome hair, huh? Malcolm Gladwell is not an academic. He's a journalist. He's a journalist who kind of specializes in talking to academics and then communicating their ideas in more approachable language to the world at large. That's kind of his wheelhouse. So he's an in-between between the public and academics. And like Stephen Jay Gould, Malcolm Gladwell's talking about IQ and how it's misunderstood through society. But before he does anything else, he defines it. IQ measures not just the quality of the person's mind, but the quality of the world that person lives in. As a journalist who's trying to explain stuff to a lay audience, a definition is very important to him. You have to make sure we're all talking the same language. And explaining the differences is what journalists do. He goes on. To say that the Dutch IQ scores rose substantially between 1952 and 1982 was another way of saying that the Netherlands in 1982 was, in at least certain respects, much more cognitively demanding than the Netherlands in 1952. An IQ, in other words, measures not so much how smart we are as how modern we are. And this isn't just definitional, it's also talking about context, how things fit together, showing the meaning behind the original statements. He goes on when he talks about H. Goddard. In the early years of the past century, established the idea that intelligence could be measured along a single linear scale. One of his particular contributions was to coin the word moron. The people who are doing the drudgery are, as a rule, in their proper places, he wrote. Now, this goes back to something that Stephen Jay Gould was talking about, but it's much more direct here in laying out how the idea of IQ fits in with how society is ordered, because this is all about context. Defining things, providing the context, presenting that information. That's what Malcolm Gladwell does. And the way IQ gets discussed in the bell curve very quickly ties into racism. Is racism particularly smart? Well, I don't think so. But that's another conversation. I entitled this video Stephen Jay Gould versus Malcolm Gladwell. And that's not really correct. You don't have to choose between them, nor should you. But let's think about how they each write and what they focus on. Stephen Jay Gould was very interested in evidence and how that evidence is used. Malcolm Gladwell was very interested in explanation, definition, and context. Should you go to one side or another? We can learn from everybody here, I think. So that's Gladwell versus Gould. Now, something I really feel the need to say is that I'm not holding either of these two authors up, or either of these two pieces of writing up as your writing needs to look like this. I admire the heck out of both of these guys, but Stephen Jay Gould, I don't want you turning in papers that are that mean and nasty, because they're not going to work unless you're a Stephen Jay Gould. And you're not writing in the same situation he is, and you're not writing in the same situation that Malcolm Gladwell is either. But there are always things you can pull out of them to make your own writing more effective. The maniacal focus on evidence and how it's used is something that everybody needs to think a lot more about. Establishing context and definitions and explaining how stuff fits together is stuff that your writing needs to do as well. So there's a lot of good lessons here for you. And we'll see when I look at your writing on how well they come through in yours. No pressure. See you in the next video.